It was a typical afternoon when Jamal, a 16-year-old high school student from a quiet neighborhood, decided to take a walk after school. His routine was simple. Like most days, head home, grab a snack, and catch up on some homework. But that day was different. As Jamal strolled down the street, his eyes caught something unusual. A sleek black car with its hazards flashing on the side of the road. The car was expensive, the kind of vehicle you see in magazines but never expect to see parked on your block. Curiosity piqued. Jamal slowed his pace, glancing at the car's flat tire. He looked around. No one was in sight. The street was unusually quiet, and the car's owner was nowhere to be found. It didn't take long for Jamal to realize that the person who owned this car probably wasn't going to do much about the tire on their own. With no one around to help, it seemed like the kind of situation he couldn't just ignore. Without thinking twice, Jamal knelt down, grabbing the tools from the car's trunk. He'd changed his share of flat tires before, helping out neighbors or relatives whenever they needed him. He didn't mind getting his hands dirty. A few minutes passed, and as he tightened the lug nuts, the sound of footsteps interrupted his focus. A man, dressed in a sharp suit, approached. He was in his mid-40s, with a confident but approachable air about him. His dark sunglasses hid most of his expression, but his surprise was evident when he saw Jamal working on his car. "Hey, you. Do you need help?" Jamal asked, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. The man took off his sunglasses and smiled, clearly impressed. "Actually, I was just about to call a tow truck. But it looks like you've got this covered," he said, his voice rich with gratitude. "I'm Mark Thompson, by the way." "Jamal," he replied, offering a handshake. Mark shook his hand firmly, still smiling. "You know, most people would have just walked past. Thanks for stopping." Jamal shrugged. "No big deal. I've done this a few times. Thought you might need a hand." Mark nodded, looking over the car, then back at Jamal. "Well, you've got a good head on your shoulders. I appreciate the help, really. How about I get you a drink or something? You earned it." Jamal wasn't the type to turn down a free drink, so they walked together to a nearby cafe. They talked for a while. Jamal about his plans for the future, and Mark about his career in business. Jamal found himself listening intently to Mark's stories about working in finance, building companies, and traveling the world. There was something about Mark's life that felt almost like a dream, a life Jamal had never imagined for himself. As they sat sipping their drinks, Mark leaned in and asked, "So tell me, Jamal, what do you want to do with your life? I mean, you've got a solid head on your shoulders." Jamal thought about it for a moment. He wasn't sure how to answer. His family didn't have much money, and he hadn't always seen many people in his community find success. But Mark's words stuck with him. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I want to do something big, something that'll make a difference." Mark smiled, as if he saw something in Jamal that others hadn't. "I like that. You know, I'm always looking for smart, driven young people. Maybe I can help you figure that out." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "You want to help me?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, why not? I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I can offer you a chance. A connection, if you will." Jamal's eyes widened. Was this real? A chance? From a millionaire? He was just a kid trying to get by. How could someone like Mark possibly want to help him? But the sincerity in Mark's eyes made Jamal want to believe him. "I don't know what to say," Jamal stammered, feeling both overwhelmed and unsure. Mark stood up, patting Jamal on the shoulder. "You don't need to say anything right now. Just think about it. I'll get in touch with you soon." The conversation ended there, but Jamal couldn't stop thinking about what Mark had said. Could this be the opportunity that would change his life? Was this the kind of break he'd been waiting for? The next day, as Jamal was getting ready to leave for school, he heard a car pull up outside. He didn't think much of it, but when he looked out the window, his jaw dropped. A brand new black SUV was parked in front of his house. It was the same type of car Mark had been driving the day before. Confused and curious, Jamal walked outside, wondering if this was some sort of mistake. As he stepped out onto the porch, the door to the SUV opened. A man dressed in a sharp suit, just like Mark, stepped out and walked toward him. The man smiled warmly. "Are you Jamal?" Jamal nodded, his heart racing. "Yeah, I am. Who are you?" The man extended his hand. "I'm Darren, Mark's associate. He sent me to talk to you." Jamal's mind raced. What was going on? Why was someone showing up at his doorstep in a car like that? And why was Mark's associate here? Was this part of the help Mark had mentioned? Darren took a deep breath before speaking. "Mark told me he saw something in you yesterday, and he wants to offer you an opportunity. He believes you've got the potential to do something big. But first, there's something you need to understand." Jamal's stomach tightened. What was this all about? And what could Mark possibly want from him now? "Let's talk inside," Darren said, his tone serious. Jamal didn't know what to do. Should he go inside with Darren? What if this was all some kind of joke? Or worse, what if it was a trap? The feeling in his gut told him something was off, but he couldn't ignore the possibility of what this could mean for his future. With his heart pounding, Jamal made the decision to follow Darren into the house. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: his life was about to change forever. But how? That he couldn't possibly predict. Jamal hesitated for a moment at the door, his thoughts racing. He glanced back toward the SUV, then back at Darren, who was waiting patiently with an air of quiet authority. Something about the man's presence was unsettling, though Jamal couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Maybe it was the suit, the car, or the fact that he was standing in front of Jamal's house, a place that had always felt so ordinary and untouched by the outside world. Jamal's mind churned with questions. Why would Mark Thompson, a successful businessman he barely knew, want to offer him an opportunity? What could a millionaire possibly see in a high school kid from his neighborhood? Was this some kind of scam or, worse, a setup? But the words Mark had said the day before echoed in his mind. Asterisk, you've got a good head on your shoulders. You've got potential asterisk. A part of Jamal wanted to turn away, slam the door shut, and retreat to the safety of his room. But another part of him, the part that had always dreamed of something bigger, something better, urged him to take the chance. He could never shake the feeling that life could be different if he just took that one step, that leap into the unknown. "Come on in," Jamal finally said, stepping aside. Darren entered the house, glancing around as if evaluating the place. It was modest, nothing too fancy, just a small living room with a worn-out couch and a couple of chairs, a TV in the corner, and a few family photos on the walls. The kind of place that people lived in, but didn't really notice. The kind of place Jamal had spent his whole life in. "Nice place," Darren said casually, but Jamal couldn't help but notice the hint of something unreadable in his voice. Was he being polite, or was he looking down on him? He couldn't tell. Jamal led Darren to the kitchen, where his mom was sitting at the table, sipping her coffee. She looked up when she saw the stranger entering, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Who's this, Jamal?" she asked, her tone cautious. She had always been protective of her son, especially after Jamal's father had passed away when he was just a toddler. Her strength had kept them both going, and she wasn't one to trust easily. "This is Darren," Jamal said, trying to sound casual. "He's here because, well, Mark Thompson sent him." His mom's eyebrows raised, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Mark Thompson," she repeated, her voice guarded. "That's the businessman, isn't it?" "Yeah," Jamal said, sitting down at the table next to her. "He wants to offer me a chance, a job or something. I don't really know the details." Darren smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made Jamal feel comfortable. It was calculated, like he was trying to read them, trying to figure out if they were worth his time. "Mark's been watching you, Jamal. He saw something in you yesterday, the way you helped him with the flat tire. It wasn't just about fixing the car. It was about your character, your initiative. Mark doesn't waste his time on people who aren't serious." Jamal shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of Darren's words. He wasn't sure if he was being complimented or sized up. "I don't know what to say," Jamal muttered, glancing over at his mom for support. She looked concerned, her eyes flicking between Jamal and Darren. "What exactly does Mark want with you?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. Darren paused before answering, as if weighing his words carefully. "Mark wants to give Jamal an opportunity, a real chance to make something of himself. It's not going to be easy. It's not a handout, but Mark believes in rewarding hard work. If Jamal is willing to take this seriously, to put in the effort, he could be looking at a future far beyond anything he's ever imagined." Jamal's mom shook her head slowly, her skepticism clear. "That sounds too good to be true. Why would someone like Mark Thompson, someone so wealthy, be interested in helping a kid like my son?" Darren leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. "Because, ma'am, some people see potential where others don't. Mark's not looking for charity, but he's also not afraid to take a chance on someone who's got the right mindset." The words "right mindset" hung in the air like a challenge. Jamal felt a mix of excitement and uncertainty bubbling inside him. Was this really happening? Could this opportunity be as big as it sounded? He took a deep breath. "What's the catch?" he asked, not willing to let himself get too carried away without understanding what he was getting into. Darren smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No catch per se, but it's not going to be easy. Mark doesn't want someone who's just looking for a quick fix or a shortcut to success. He wants people who are willing to work for what they get. This won't be a 9-to-5 job. You'll have to prove yourself day in and day out. And trust me, if you can't handle the pressure, you won't last long." Jamal felt a tightening in his chest. This wasn't a simple job offer, it was a test. A test of his commitment, his ability to handle the demands of a world he knew almost nothing about. He'd always dreamed of something more, but now that the chance was right in front of him, it felt overwhelming. "And what happens if I decide I'm not cut out for it?" Jamal asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Darren's eyes flicked to his mom, then back to Jamal. "Then you walk away. No harm, no foul. But if you take this seriously, if you prove yourself, Mark will make sure you're set for life." Jamal's mom stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't like this, Jamal. I don't trust this man or his offer. No one gives something for nothing." Jamal understood his mom's concern. She had always worked hard to make sure they had what they needed. The idea of someone like Mark Thompson just showing up and offering a life-changing opportunity seemed too good to be true. But something deep inside Jamal urged him to take the chance. "I'll think about it, Mom," he said, trying to calm her down. Darren stood up, signaling that their conversation was coming to a close. "Mark's serious about this, Jamal. Don't take too long to decide. Opportunities like this don't come around often." As Darren turned to leave, Jamal's mind was spinning. Was this the chance of a lifetime, or was it all a game? What was Mark really expecting from him, and what did he want in return? Jamal knew he had to be careful, but deep down, he felt like he couldn't let this slip away. There was too much at stake. The door closed behind Darren, and Jamal was left alone with his thoughts, and a feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. But for better or worse, it was already too late to turn back. Jamal sat back down at the kitchen table after Darren left, his thoughts in a whirlwind. His mom, who had been quiet ever since the conversation shifted, now paced back and forth, the sound of her shoes against the wooden floor echoing through the otherwise quiet house. "Jamal, listen to me," she said, her voice low but urgent. "This doesn't feel right. People like Mark Thompson don't just show up and offer people like you opportunities. There's always something behind it. Always a price to pay." Jamal could feel the weight of her concern pressing on him. She was right to be cautious. In the neighborhood they lived in, nothing ever came for free, and every time someone had offered a helping hand, there had been a hidden agenda. It was the way things worked. He had learned that lesson early, especially after his father had passed and his mother had been left to figure everything out on her own. But then there was the other part of Jamal, his ambition. He had always dreamed of breaking out, of getting away from the narrow streets of his neighborhood. The only problem was, every dream had come with a price, and most of those dreams turned out to be unattainable. He stared down at his hands, the palms still rough from the tire change earlier that day. It was hard to ignore the voice in his head, the voice that told him this might be different. Mark had seen something in him, something Jamal hadn't even seen in himself. And that, more than anything, made him want to take the chance, even if it scared him. "I'm not saying it's a perfect offer, Mom," Jamal said, his voice hesitant but firm. His mom stopped pacing and fixed her gaze on him. Her eyes were filled with the same love and concern she always had for him, but now they were mixed with an unspoken fear. She knew better than anyone how easy it was to get sucked into things that looked too good to be true. "I don't want you to be someone's project, Jamal. You've got your own dreams. You don't need to depend on a rich man to make them come true," she said, her voice quieter now. "I just want you to be careful." Jamal looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He understood her fears. She'd worked too hard to get where they were, and she had seen too many people in their neighborhood get burned by empty promises. But the idea of walking away from what Mark had offered felt impossible. How could he turn his back on a chance like that? He wasn't sure, but he knew he had to make a decision soon. Later that evening, after his mom had gone to bed, Jamal found himself staring at his phone, unsure whether he should call Mark or let things lie. He knew he couldn't let it go for long. If he didn't respond, Mark might think he wasn't serious, and that would be the end of it. But something inside him hesitated. Maybe it was the unknown. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that there was more to this than he understood. A knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he stood up and moved cautiously toward the door. When he opened it, there was no one there. But lying on the ground was a small, unmarked envelope. It was a simple, cream-colored envelope with no return address, just his name scrawled across the front in neat handwriting. Jamal bent down, his curiosity piqued. He opened the envelope, and inside was a single card. It was black, with a gold logo embossed on the front, a logo that Jamal recognized from the brief conversation with Darren earlier. It was Mark's company logo. He flipped the card over, and there, written in bold letters, were 3 words: "*, you're ready now." *. Jamal's stomach tightened. What did that mean? How did they know he was ready? Was it part of the offer, or was there something else going on that he wasn't being told? The card felt like a signal, but of what? Was it an invitation, a test, or something more sinister? His mind raced with possibilities, and before he knew it, his fingers were dialing Mark's number. The phone rang once, then twice, before Mark's voice picked up on the other end. "Jamal, you got the card," Mark said, as if he had been expecting it. "Yeah," Jamal replied, trying to sound calm, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "I got it. What does it mean? What's going on here, Mark?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Jamal thought he might have pushed too far. But then Mark spoke again, his voice low, almost cryptic. "It means you're closer than you think, Jamal. There's more to this than what I told you earlier. But if you want in, you need to trust me. Trust that I know what I'm doing, and that I'm offering you something real. But you can't back out now, not after the card. Do you understand?" Jamal felt a wave of unease wash over him. He wasn't sure what he was agreeing to, but the weight of Mark's words felt heavy. What had he really gotten himself into? Was this all part of a larger plan, something that Mark hadn't told him about yet? I don't know," Jamal stammered, his uncertainty growing. "You said I could walk away if I wanted to, but now you're saying I can't." Mark's voice softened, almost reassuring. "I'm not saying you can't walk away. I'm saying this is the point of no return. Once you step into this world, you can't go back to what you were doing before. There's no going back to the old life, Jamal. It's not about the money. It's about what you're capable of." Jamal felt the tension in his chest increase. What did Mark mean by that? What was he really offering, and what did he expect in return? Was it just a business opportunity, or was there more to it? Before he could ask another question, Mark added, "I'll send someone to meet you tomorrow. They'll tell you everything you need to know. Be ready." And with that, the line went dead. Jamal stood there, staring at the phone in his hand. The decision was no longer his to make. Whatever this was, it was bigger than him, but he had no choice now. Tomorrow he would meet someone else, a new face, a new chapter in his life, and he would have to decide whether to dive in headfirst or walk away from everything he had dreamed of. The next day, Jamal woke up early, his mind racing. He hadn't slept much, and when he did, it was filled with restless dreams of darkened streets and shadowy figures offering him deals he couldn't fully understand. The weight of the decision he had to make hung over him like a dark cloud. Was he really ready for this? Was he really ready to step into a world that was so far removed from everything he knew? As the morning dragged on, he found it harder to focus on anything else. His mom had left for work, giving him some space to think, but it didn't help. All he could do was wait. Every minute felt like an hour. He kept looking at the time, wondering when the person Mark had promised would show up. Around noon, a black car pulled up outside his house. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he watched it roll to a stop. He recognized it immediately, another sleek, dark vehicle, similar to the one Mark had been in. The driver, a tall man in a black suit, stepped out and looked around before walking up to Jamal's front door. His face was cold and unreadable. Jamal opened the door before the man could knock, his pulse hammering in his ears. "You Jamal?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, that's me," Jamal replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though it shook slightly. The man didn't smile. Instead, he handed Jamal a small envelope, no logo this time, just plain white. "Mark wants you to see this. He's serious." Jamal hesitated, his eyes scanning the man's face, trying to gauge whether there was anything he should be worried about. He could feel the man's intense gaze, studying him, waiting for him to make a move. Jamal took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the paper. It was cold to the touch, almost like it was meant to send a chill down his spine. The man turned and began walking back toward the car, not even bothering to see if Jamal followed. Without thinking, Jamal ripped the envelope open and pulled out the contents. Inside was another card. This one was different, slightly thicker, with an embossed silver seal in the shape of an eye, its design intricate and unsettling. On the back of the card were more words. Asterisk, the time has come. Trust no one. Asterisk. Jamal felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the card. The message was cryptic, but it sent a shiver through him. What did it mean? Why had Mark given him this? And why the warning to trust no one? His mind spun in circles as he stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. The air inside the house felt heavier now, as if the walls were closing in. He thought about calling Mark, but part of him feared that doing so would make things worse. Instead, he sank onto the couch, staring at the card in his hand, his thoughts dark and twisted. The words echoed in his head. Asterisk, trust no one, asterisk. Was this some kind of game? A test? Mark had promised an opportunity, but with every step, Jamal felt more and more like he was being drawn into something he didn't fully understand. He had no one to talk to about this, not his mom, not his friends, not even the people he'd grown up with. This wasn't the kind of thing that could be shared, not without risking everything. So he sat alone in the quiet house, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him harder than ever before. As the afternoon wore on, Jamal grew restless. The clock ticked on, each minute stretching longer than the last. He kept checking the time, wondering if he had missed something, if he had missed the next step in whatever this was. Should he leave? Should he just show up at Mark's office and demand answers? Just then, there was another knock at the door. Jamal's heart leaped in his chest, the sudden sound breaking the tense silence. He walked quickly to the door, his hands shaking as he reached for the handle. The man from earlier stood there, his face as emotionless as before. "It's time," the man said, his voice flat. Jamal nodded, though his throat was tight. He didn't know where he was going or what he was walking into, but he knew there was no turning back now. Everything had led to this moment. The man turned and began walking toward the car, and Jamal followed him without hesitation, the cold air outside cutting through his thin shirt. As they drove through the city, Jamal could feel the weight of the silence in the car. The man beside him didn't speak a word, and Jamal didn't know what to ask, didn't know where to begin. The streets outside blurred as they passed, the familiar cityscape turning into a foreign landscape, one that felt more and more like a dream or a nightmare. They pulled up to an unmarked building on the edge of town, a towering structure that seemed to loom over them, casting long shadows over the empty street. It was an industrial area, quiet and desolate, the kind of place people avoided after dark. The man got out without a word, and Jamal followed him, his footsteps echoing in the empty lot. Inside the building, the air was stale, and the walls were lined with dark, oppressive metal. Jamal's heart raced as he walked down a narrow hallway, the dim lights flickering overhead. There were no signs, no indication of where he was going. He could feel a tension rising in his chest, his thoughts spiraling with every step. The man stopped in front of a heavy, steel door, his hand resting on the handle. "This is it," he said, his voice quiet. The man opened the door and stepped aside, gesturing for Jamal to enter. The moment Jamal stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. It was a large, dimly lit room, filled with shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. And at the far end, seated at a desk, was Mark Thompson himself. Mark looked up as Jamal entered, his face unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. There was a moment of silence, and then Mark spoke, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "You're here, Jamal. Now, let's see if you're truly ready." As Jamal stepped into the room, the cold air seemed to wrap around him, suffocating him with a sense of impending doom. Mark's eyes locked onto his, unreadable and calculating. The space between them felt charged, like something unseen was vibrating in the air. Jamal's heart pounded, and his fingers instinctively tightened around the card Mark had given him earlier. It was the only thing in the room that felt real, that grounded him in the chaos unfolding around him. Mark motioned to the seat across from his desk. "Sit, Jamal," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an undertone Jamal couldn't quite place. Jamal hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He took a deep breath and sat, trying to steady himself. The chair creaked under his weight as he leaned back, eyes darting around the dimly lit room. There was something about the place, the sterile, clinical vibe, that made him feel like he was stepping into something much bigger than himself. Mark didn't immediately speak, his eyes never leaving Jamal's face. The silence stretched on, unbearable, until Jamal could no longer stand it. "Why did you bring me here?" Jamal asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "What is this really about?" Mark's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I told you before, Jamal. I see potential in you. But potential is only the beginning. What I'm offering isn't just an opportunity, it's a doorway. And when you walk through it, everything changes. For you, for your family, for the entire world." The cryptic words hung in the air, and Jamal felt a surge of unease. He wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but there was something about Mark's presence, something in the way he spoke, that made him hesitate, as if somehow the words themselves were part of a game, a puzzle he wasn't ready to solve yet. Before Jamal could respond, the door behind him creaked open, and another figure entered the room. The new person was a woman, tall and dressed in a sharp black suit. She had an air of authority about her, but her eyes were cold and calculating, much like Mark's. There was something unsettling about her, something Jamal couldn't place. "Jamal, this is Rachel," Mark said, gesturing toward the woman. "She's going to help you understand the next steps. But first, you need to make a choice. Jamal looked from Mark to Rachel, confused. A choice? He repeated, his voice shaky. What choice? Rachel stepped forward, her heels kicking sharply against the floor, and handed Jamal a small silver key. This, she said, her voice smooth as silk, is your key to everything. It will open a door, one that's been waiting for you. But you need to understand something, Jamal. There's no turning back. Once you use this, there's no going back to your old life. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. The key felt heavy in his hand, as though it held the weight of all the decisions he'd ever made. The silence in the room was deafening, and Jamal could feel his pulse racing. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together what was happening. The offer, the mysterious cards, the cryptic messages, they all led to this moment, but he still didn't know what it meant. Before he could say anything, the door opened again, this time with a force that made Jamal jump. Another figure stepped into the room, and this time it wasn't someone he recognized. It was a man, middle-aged, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through him. He wore a long coat, but there was something in his posture, a kind of stillness, that made Jamal uneasy. He looked like someone who had seen things, done things, that Jamal couldn't even imagine. "Mark, we need to talk," the man said, his voice gravelly, as if it had been worn down by years of use. "This isn't the right time for this." Mark's expression darkened, and for the first time, Jamal saw a flicker of emotion, anger, perhaps, or frustration. "You're here," Mark said, his voice cold, "and now you're interrupting." The man glanced at Jamal, then back at Mark. "You're playing a dangerous game. This kid isn't ready." Jamal felt a chill run through him at the man's words. Not ready, he wasn't sure what was happening, but everything in him screamed that this was spiraling out of control. "Get out," Mark snapped, his voice low and dangerous. "This is my decision." The man didn't argue. Instead, he gave Jamal one last look, one that seemed to carry an unspoken warning, before turning and leaving the room as abruptly as he had entered. Jamal sat frozen, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. What had just happened? Who was that man? Why had he tried to intervene? Mark seemed to shake off the confrontation as though it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His eyes returned to Jamal, this time with an intensity that felt like a weight on his chest. "Jamal, you've been given a choice," Mark said slowly. "You can use the key, or you can walk away. But if you walk away, the door closes forever. This world you've stumbled into, it doesn't wait for anyone." Jamal looked at the key again, his mind racing. He could feel a tension building, pressing in on him from all sides. Mark's words echoed in his ears. There's no going back, asterisk. But was this really the opportunity he'd been waiting for? What would it cost him? And why had that man intervened? Before Jamal could respond, Rachel spoke again, her voice smooth, but with an edge. "It's not about what you want, Jamal. It's about what you're capable of. We don't give second chances." The finality of her words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. There was no room for doubt anymore. The path he took now would change everything. His life, his future, everything hung in the balance. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying Jamal carefully. "You have 1 minute. Choose." Jamal could feel the weight of the key in his hand, and he could feel the eyes of both Mark and Rachel on him, waiting for him to make the final move. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing on him, as if time itself was running out. What would he do? Would he walk away from the life he knew, or would he step through the door into whatever darkness awaited him on the other side? The decision was his, and the moment of truth was now. Jamal's hand tightened around the key, his mind racing with possibilities. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into eternity. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath quickened. The room felt like it was closing in around him, the air thick with pressure. There was no turning back, not now. He had to choose, and he had to do it now. Mark's eyes never left him, his gaze intense and calculating. Rachel stood silently beside him, her arms crossed, waiting for Jamal's decision. The weight of their expectations bore down on him, like they were waiting for him to step into a world he didn't fully understand. Jamal felt like he was caught in the middle of something much bigger than himself, something dangerous, something that could change the course of his life forever. Jamal began, but his words faltered as the key felt heavier in his hand. Mark didn't let him finish. Time's up. The finality of his words hit Jamal like a brick. Without thinking, he stood, his body moving on its own as if it had already made the decision for him. He stepped forward, key in hand, and without looking back at either Mark or Rachel, he placed the key into a small hidden lock in the corner of the room. It clicked. The sound was deafening. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, the silence thick and oppressive. But then, as if the walls themselves had come alive, the floor began to tremble, ever so slightly at first, and then with greater force. Jamal staggered back, his hand shooting out to grab the edge of Mark's desk for support. The ground shook beneath him, and he could feel a strange energy surging in the room. "What's happening?" Jamal demanded, his voice rising with panic. Mark's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't the smile of someone who had won. It was something darker, something almost triumphant. "You've opened the door, Jamal. The path is yours now." Jamal's eyes darted around the room. He could feel the presence of something unseen, something powerful. The air crackled with an energy he couldn't explain. The walls seemed to stretch, pulling him into the unknown. But he had no time to process it. Before he could react, the ground beneath him gave way with a loud crash. Jamal tumbled, his world spinning as he fell into the dark abyss. The coldness surrounded him, and he could feel the weight of gravity pulling him deeper and deeper. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the void, swallowed up by the darkness. And then, everything stopped. He landed with a thud on hard concrete. For a moment, everything was still, and Jamal lay there, his body aching, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His eyes blinked rapidly as he tried to adjust to the dim lighting around him. It was a basement of sorts, but unlike anything he'd ever seen before. The walls were stone, ancient and cracked, and the air smelled damp and musty. Jamal slowly pushed himself up, shaking off the disorientation. The key was still in his hand, but now it felt strange, as though it had a life of its own. He looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. There were shelves lining the walls, filled with strange objects, books, artifacts, and objects that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't understand. A figure stepped out from the shadows, and Jamal's breath caught in his throat. It was the man who had interrupted earlier, the one who had warned him not to go through with this. His eyes were dark, filled with secrets, and his presence exuded power. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he just looked at Jamal with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. "But now that you're here, you have no choice." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What is this place? What's going on?" The man took a step closer, his gaze piercing. "I'm the one who warned you, and I'm the one who tried to stop you. This isn't just an opportunity, Jamal. It's a trap. Mark, he's been playing you from the start." Jamal's head spun. "What do you mean?" "He's the one who gave me the key. He said this was my chance." "No," the man interrupted, his voice cold. "Mark is not who he says he is. He's been building a network, pulling people like you into his schemes. But he's not the mastermind to Jamal. He's just a pawn. The real power, it's in this place, in these artifacts. And you're the key to unlocking it all." The man reached out and grabbed Jamal's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "The door you just opened, it's not just a physical door, it's a doorway to something much darker. A world you can't even imagine. And now that you're here, there's no leaving." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as the gravity of the situation sank in. "What do you mean, there's no leaving?" The man's eyes hardened. Once you step into this world, you belong to it. You become part of something ancient, something that has been waiting for the right person to open the door. You're the one who will either bring it to life or destroy it. Jamal's mind raced. Asterisk destroy it. Asterisk, what was he talking about? He had just thought this was some opportunity, something to help him get ahead in life. He never imagined he was walking into something this sinister. You can still stop it, the man said, his voice low, almost pleading. You can turn back, you just have to close the door. But before Jamal could react, a sound echoed through the basement, loud, like a drum beat, and then a low hum filled the room. The shelves began to shake, the objects on them rattling with a strange energy. The door that Jamal had opened, the one that had led him here, began to close of its own accord. But the man, sensing the impending danger, shouted, "No, you have to stop it, Jamal. Don't let it close." Jamal's heart raced as he moved toward the door, his mind in turmoil. Was there even a choice now? Was it too late to go back? But before he could reach the door, everything went dark. And just as quickly as it had started, the hum stopped. The room fell silent. Jamal looked around, his breath coming fast. The figure of the man was gone. And Mark was nowhere to be found either. But in the middle of the room, something glowed. It was the key. And as Jamal approached it, he saw the final chilling truth. The key had changed. It no longer resembled the one he had used. It had transformed, now a symbol that pulsed with dark power. And that's when he realized, asterisk, he was no longer the one making the. Jamal stood frozen in place, his mind racing. The key in front of him pulsed with a strange, unnatural light. It had morphed, taken on an ominous new shape, something far beyond what he had ever imagined when he first held it in his hand. His thoughts raced back to the moment he had stepped into this place, how he had been pulled into this web of mystery, danger, and uncertainty. Everything had felt like a choice, but now he realized the truth. There had never been a choice. He had been led here, manipulated, every step along the way. His heart hammered in his chest as the glow from the key intensified. Was it too late to go back? Was there even a way out? He glanced around the room, trying to make sense of the disorienting darkness that surrounded him. But nothing made sense anymore. The man who had warned him was gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only his cryptic words. Mark's intentions had never been clear. But now Jamal understood the most unsettling truth of all. He had been part of a much larger plan, one he couldn't even comprehend yet. The door was still closing, but not completely. There was a sliver of light, barely visible, where the doorway had once been. The room seemed to shrink with every passing moment, and Jamal felt a suffocating pressure weigh down on him. He had to act, but what was he supposed to do? The key, could it still unlock something more, or had it sealed him in forever? His hand trembled as he reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the key, everything around him seemed to pulse in unison. The walls, the floor, the air itself vibrated with energy, and Jamal felt the overwhelming sensation of being drawn into something much larger than himself. The key seemed to respond to his touch, as though it was alive, pulling him into its power. But even as it gave him a glimpse of its terrifying influence, Jamal knew he could not back down now. With a deep breath, Jamal forced himself to take control. "I don't know what this is, but I'm not going to let it control me," he whispered to himself. Suddenly, the door stopped closing. The energy in the room shifted, and Jamal felt something, a pull, like an invisible thread, draw him toward the key. He stood there for a long moment, staring at it, feeling the weight of his decision. He wasn't sure what the key was meant to unlock, but one thing was clear. He had to be the one to decide how it would affect him, not let it dictate his life any longer. Taking one final step forward, Jamal raised the key above his head. The moment he did, the room seemed to shift again. The shadows deepened, the air grew colder, and for a fleeting moment, Jamal thought he saw a flash of movement in the corner of his eye. It was the figure of the man who had warned him earlier, the one who had tried to stop him. But just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure was gone. Jamal's breath hitched as he thrust the key into the air, as if willing the power that it held to break free. And in that instant, everything around him seemed to change. The walls of the room seemed to crumble, and the ground beneath his feet gave way. It was as if reality itself was bending, collapsing, and reforming. In that moment, Jamal was no longer in control. But then something unexpected happened. He was no longer alone. The figure who had disappeared earlier, the man who had tried to intervene, appeared again, this time standing directly in front of him. But this time, there was no fear in the man's eyes. Instead, there was a sense of resolve, of purpose. The air between them was thick with tension, but Jamal could see something had changed in the man's demeanor. "I didn't want it to go this far," the man said quietly, almost regretfully. "But now it's too late. You've opened the door, and now we all have to live with what comes next." Jamal's heart raced, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. All he could do was watch as the man approached, his presence now calming, like a steadying force amidst the chaos. "This is the moment, Jamal," the man continued. "The key isn't just a tool, it's a test, and you've passed it. But the real question is, what will you do with it now?" Jamal's grip tightened on the key as he finally found his voice. "I'm not sure I understand," he admitted, his voice shaky but determined. "What happens next?" The man's eyes softened. "That's the part you have to decide for yourself. The key can give you power. It can change everything about your life. But it's not about the key, Jamal. It's about what you're willing to do with it. Will you use it for your own gain, or will you destroy it before it destroys you?" Jamal thought for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had been offered everything: power, wealth, influence. But at what cost? He had seen the darkness that lay beneath the surface of the offer, the manipulation, the dangers hidden in every promise. "No," he said quietly, more to himself than to the man. "I'm not going to let it control me anymore." The man nodded, his expression one of approval. "Good, you've made the right choice." In the silence that followed, Jamal felt a strange sense of clarity. The key's power was still there, pulsing in his hand, but it no longer seemed so daunting. The darkness that had surrounded him now seemed to recede, like a storm finally passing. For the first time since he had found the key, Jamal felt in control of his own destiny. As he stared at the glowing object, he made a decision. He would destroy it. He wouldn't let the power consume him. He wouldn't be another pawn in someone else's game. With a single motion, he threw the key onto the ground, and before his eyes, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The moment it broke, the energy in the room dissipated, the strange hum fading into silence. The air was still again, and for the first time, Jamal felt free. The man who had been watching him took a step back, a slight smile crossing his face. "You've done it, Jamal. You freed yourself from the power that sought to control you." Jamal looked around the room, now completely empty. Everything was calm, and he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The key had been the catalyst, but it had never been the answer. The answer had always been in him, the choice to rise above the darkness, to not let his circumstances define him. And as Jamal left the room, stepping out into the sunlight for the first time in what felt like ages, he knew one thing for certain: the real power was never in the key. It was in the choices he made, the decisions that shaped who he was and who he would become. For Jamal, the journey wasn't over. But now he was in control of his own path, and whatever came next, he was ready for it.